It is election day tomorrow. One of the most fascinating races is the gubernatorial race in Mississippi. There, a popular Democratic incumbent state attorney general, Jim Hood, is running against Republican Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves, and the polling has them essentially neck and neck. But here's the problem. Neck and neck isn't good enough in the state of Mississippi. Even if Hood were to eke out a narrow victory in deep red Mississippi, which in these polarized times itself would be amazing, he probably will not be governor. In fact, the estimates are that the Republican lieutenant governor, the Republican candidate, could lose by up to 9 points in the popular vote and still be named the next governor. How, you ask, is that possible? Well, it turns out the state constitution of Mississippi has its own version of something like the Electoral College. In order to be elected governor, a candidate has to win an outright majority in the statewide vote, but also carry the most votes in a majority of Mississippi's 122 House districts. So let's just say your support is concentrated in heavily black districts in the very segregated environs of Mississippi. It's going to be real hard to carry a majority of the House districts. And if a candidate doesn't win both a majority of the popular vote and a majority of those districts, well, then the Mississippi House of Representatives, which is overwhelmingly Republican and massively gerrymandered, gets to pick the governor. So why on earth would the framers of the Mississippi State Constitution of 1890 have done this? Luckily, they were extremely explicit about their intentions at the time. In 1889, Senator James George was predicting that African Americans would soon outnumber white voters in the state 2-1, so he called for a new constitution that would ensure, quote, home government under the control of the white people of the state. One of the framers of that new constitution was a man named James K. Vardaman, who would go on to become a U.S. senator and governor of Mississippi. Here's how he put it, quote, there is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter. Mississippi's Constitutional Convention of 1890 was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the N-word from politics. In other words, after white supremacists in the South used violence and terrorism to beat back universal male suffrage for everyone, black and white, during Reconstruction, they then put into place explicitly white supremacist, anti-majoritarian governing structures to preserve white control of the state at all costs. That included as well poll taxes and literary tests designed to suppress the black vote, which have since been struck down. But despite the fact that the gubernatorial voting system is pretty clearly unconstitutional, it has not been struck down. It is still the law 129 years later. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.